your photography game and understand those settings in your camera? Well, today we'll be talking about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Welcome, my name is Joshua Poplowski, and today we're going to be talking about camera basics. This is going to be a series of videos, so subscribe for those future videos. So let's jump right into it. The first setting, probably the most important setting, is shutter speed. Shutter speed is represented by that fraction that you see in your camera settings. You'll read it as 1/50th of a second or 1/1000th of a second. And what that means is how fast or how slow the photo is actually being taken. The higher the number, the faster it takes a photo. So 1/1000th of a second means it's taking a photo at 1/1000th of a second. That's why it's referred to as that. There's a physical door that's actually opening and closing in front of the sensor, which dictates how much light actually reaches the sensor. Having a faster shutter speed is going to allow less light to reach the actual sensor, which is going to be darkening your image, or it's going to be stopping a fast-moving object in time. Having a slow shutter speed is going to allow more light to hit that sensor, which then you'll have a brighter image, and you're going to have some motion blur in there if the object is moving fast. But if your subject is sitting still, like product photography or a portrait, you could get away with a slow shutter speed. So for example, let's look at this picture. Now you can see that I took this photo at 1/50th of a second. You can see how there's motion blur in there. It's not crisp, it's not sharp in every aspect of the photo. That's because with the slow shutter speed, it's allowing more stuff to move as that shutter is opening and closing while the image is being taken. If you increase the shutter to, let's say, 1/400th of a second, and take that same image, you could see that everything is stopped in motion, everything's sharp, everything's clear, just because it's allowing less stuff to move in front of the sensor while it's taking the photo. So you want to have a slow shutter though when you're shooting like landscapes or portraits, product photography, anything that is not moving quick or some things that are just standing still, that's when you want to use a slow shutter. When you want to use a fast shutter is if you're taking a picture of a moving car or you're doing sports photography. When your subject's moving fast, that's when you want to increase that shutter speed to make it look like they were just stopped in time. So the next setting that we're going to be talking about is aperture. Aperture is represented by f-stops. When you hear somebody refer to a lens as a fast lens, they're usually referring to the aperture. Having a lens with an aperture of 2.8 or lower is usually a fast lens. But the reason that it is a fast lens is because it allows more light to come through the lens, which allows you to have a higher shutter speed. This comes an advantage when you're indoors shooting basketball or volleyball, some sort of sports photography, or something of where your subject's moving real fast and you don't have a lot of light, or you can't even set up some professional lighting. So you can see now where these two settings are coming into play with each other and how one affects the other. There's these actual blades that are within the lens that open and close, which makes the diameter bigger or smaller, allowing more or less light to come through the lens. Now when you're seeing those blurry backgrounds, that's usually represented by aperture. Having a low aperture is going to give you a shallow depth of field. Shallow depth of field meaning you're going to get those nice blurry backgrounds that everyone loves to see. However, shooting at a lower aperture though is going to give you a shallow depth of field, which is great for those blurry backgrounds, but it's also going to give you a smaller focus point. So being at f1.8, you could have your subject's nose in focus while their eyes aren't in focus. But you prefer to have the eyes in focus if you're shooting portraits. It's just going to make it look so much better. If you have your aperture at 5.6, it's going to give you a larger focus point, it's going to give you less depth of field, but it's going to allow more things to be in focus. If you're doing real estate photography, you might want to have it up to like 5.6 or 6.3. It's just going to make sure every part of the house is in focus. However, if your lens can't go down past like 3.5, because that's what some of these kit lenses do, you can still achieve that shallow depth of field by compression, meaning having a longer focal length on your lens. Having like a 200 or 300 millimeter lens, you're going to have that nice compression at 300 millimeters, giving you that nice shallow depth of field. So let's take this photo as an example. You can see that the exposure is perfect on it and everything is in focus, including the subject and the background. However, for a photo like this, we want to make sure that subject stands out, and how we do that is by lowering our aperture to an f2.8, and it's going to give you that nice blurry background, and make that subject stand out. That background's not always going to be very pleasing, so how you can make it more pleasing is by having that shallow depth of field. The whole point of professional photos is to make sure your subject stands out. That's what's going to differentiate you from your competitors or from people just starting out, or if you're just trying to make your images pop a little bit more. Now moving into the third most important setting, ISO. ISO you can look at as fake light. It's how sensitive your sensor is to actual light. Now ISO, depending on the camera you have, if it's a crop sensor, if it's a full frame sensor, it's going to affect the image differently. It can be a tricky setting to get down though, because the higher you go in your ISO, the more grainy your photos are going to get, or what we refer to as noise. Now when you're playing around with your ISO, you usually have your shutter speed where you want it, your aperture where you want it, but the image still is not bright enough. So that's when you're going to want to crank up your ISO. The main places that you're going to be cranking up your ISO though is when you're indoors, you don't have all that light, or you don't even have that light that you're looking for, or maybe you're shooting into a closet or into a container that has more shadows and it's just darker within that container itself. ISO, you're just going to want to crank it up a little bit here and there, making sure that the image isn't too grainy, because then you could always bring it into Lightroom or whatever photo editing software you're using to brighten that image up without it getting grainy. So you need to learn these settings though like it's the back of your hand. You need to be able to just look at an image. If it's overexposed, underexposed, you're going to have to know what settings to do, how to crank them up or what to change, just to make sure that that image is perfectly exposed, get that nice, crisp, sharp image that you're looking for. When you can look at an image though and know what to change on it to make it look better, that's when you should take the next step in photography. It's like anything else in life. When you master a certain step, you're going to want to then learn the next steps, so then you can continuously get better and continuously just make your pictures and just anything in life stand out a whole lot more. So I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, please leave a like on this and consider subscribing. Thank you guys, and until next time, I'll talk to you.